Well, our next guest this week is a special one. A lot of people remember Ross Oakley, of course, for his role as the AFL CEO from 1986 through to 1996, other roles he's had in sports since, but was a former Saint and a very unlucky one at that. He actually has the second highest winning percentage of any St Kilda player that's played more than 50 games. Now, you look at our history and suggest that that's probably not hugely surprising given the era in which he played, but was seriously injured in the 1965 semi-final against Collingwood and in the semi-final of 1966. St Kilda would play in the grand final in both of those years and obviously win the premiership in 1966. So he was perilously close to being such a vital cog in that most famous of St Kilda wins. But Ross, thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
I guess when you talk to people about your career, obviously you are such a revered figure as somebody who ran the game. Do you find that you often have to remind people that you played for St Kilda as well, because it's not the first thing they go to?
Yeah, I suppose they do, particularly the younger people, because they weren't around when I played football. That doesn't fuss me. It's time past, and they were great days, but all we've got is memories now.
Ross, I'm sure we'll get to elements of your time running the game a little bit later on, but why don't we start off with how did you end up at St Kilda?
I was at school in 1961. And I went to Wesley, and it was our third premiership in a row we won at school. And at the end of that school year, the Collegians A grade side, which is the old Wesley Collegians, asked me to come down and play the last 3 games of the year and qualify for the finals, which I did. I played in the finals, and at the grand final, Alan Jeans was watching. And it was very casual. I kicked a few goals in that final, and he came up to him in the rooms afterwards, after we won the flag, and said, "Laddie, I think you should come down and train with us." And if you knew Alan Jeans, you'd know exactly. He'd call me Laddie, and I said, "Yes, Mr. Jeans, I'd be delighted to do that." No talking me into it at all. So they sent me a notice early in the new year, and I went down to St Kilda, and I was in the St Kilda district. You know, that we had zones in those days, and I was in the St Kilda district, so it all worked pretty well.
So pretty much broke into the team going towards the end of 62. 63, played a fair amount of games again. Took to round 6 to get into the side. Was there an injury, or was it just I had an injury. I had an injury. I broke my leg in a practice match, and I was back into the pack, and the pack fell on me, and I broke the bone in my leg, lower leg. So I missed quite a few games at the start of the year, and then got into the team and played for the rest of the year.
Looking at, obviously, your injuries will get discussed at some point and what happened in those finals, but the second last game you ever played for the club, that game against Hawthorn at the end of 66, a significant game. There was the talk around the Bulldog injury. We're actually in trouble a little bit against a team that missed the finals. We had to dig it out to win. You've kicked 3, had 19 possessions. I guess how proud of you of the fact that, I guess if you didn't play that well that day, St Kilda probably don't win the flag.
Yeah, look, there are always moments like that you can look back on. We had a fantastic team, and there was always someone able to bob up. When you had players like Borlock and Stewart and Dietrich and Rossi Smith, I mean, I could go on. They were all fantastic. Vernon Howe, all Brownlow medalists, except for Doc, but he's certainly a Hall of Famer. we had a fantastic team, and there was always someone who was able to step up and do something to get us out of a hole, and that was the strength of the team, I think.
Speaking of strengths of the team, that 65 year, obviously we kind of, everything started to come together for us as a football club. A heap of talent, as you just mentioned, but what was it, I guess, at the start or midway through 65 that kind of, brought the group together to the point that they were ready to play off in a grand final?
Well, it had been building up. We were really starting to build towards 65 in 64 and 63. We get players coming into the side, strengthening the side right through that period. It was a build up, and in 65 everything seemed to go pretty right for us, and set us up for the 66 win. I've always said that you always need to lose a grand final to get the motivation to come back and win one, and it seems to have happened right through the history of football.
And that transition to 65, losing, obviously still hurts missing out on the game, and then you get back, you go through 66 and the same thing happens again and you're sitting on the sideline again.
Yeah.
What's the sort of thoughts going through your head at that time, basically watching him lose and then watching him win? And what are the thoughts on the days in those two situations?
Well, on the day that we won it, I was sitting up in the stand with Carl Dittrich. Remember, he'd been suspended, so he was pretty down on the mouth, but we were ecstatic about the win. The moment the siren went, we both bounded out of the stand, down through the rooms and out onto the ground, and we sort of joined in with the celebrations on the ground. But there was still a bit of a feeling that you weren't part of it because you weren't out there on the day. And unfortunately, I think St Kilda administration at the time allowed that to occur and allowed it to continue. And there's the famous story where they had the big after party, and I wasn't invited, neither was Carl. Believe it or not, they didn't have room, but quite a few of the administrators were there and trainers and whatever else, but there wasn't room for us. Then Carl got a ring to say someone had dropped out, he was in, so he went along. Then I think the day before, I got a phone call to say someone else has dropped out, you're in. I said, well, I'm unavailable, I've organised something else. So I didn't go to the after party because I had my nose out of joint severely. They took the only picture that I think that the club took that year was the 20 players that made the ground. And, I played pretty much right through the year, and so had Carl. And we didn't even get a look in. There wasn't even, a picture taken. I understand they take a picture of the premiership players, fine. There wasn't even a club picture taken, the list, as it were, for that year. So I thought that was a bit ordinary, but ever since then, when the players have had a function, have always invited Carl and I and made us feel part of what happened, and I really appreciated that from the guys, because it was the team themselves that were actually showing the club administration what this is all about. It's about everyone that contributed, not just on that one day, but everyone that contributed to the club. So I've been to quite a few of the functions that the premiership team have had since that time, and I think I also went to a club organised one. So I think the club's learned some lessons too out of all of that.
Having said all that, and having been through that exact experience, and also having been on the other side as someone who's kind of led the league, how do you feel about the comparisons with other, I guess, international sports, where if you're on the squad, if you're on the roster, of a championship winning team, you're still counted as a championship player, like the NBA or the Premier League. If you play a certain number of games, you get called a Premier League winning player. How does that sit with you?
Oh, look, my views and feelings are right out there. I've discussed them on many occasions. It's not just the 18 or 20 players that ran out in the field on the day. You've got to get there. And there's a lot of players during the year that help you get there. And the 20 players that actually represent the club on that day have got a privilege because they actually are the ones that selected on the day as a result of all sorts of things, of them playing well, but also other players being injured, other players missing out as a result of a tribunal mishap. But the way to build a group and to build a club is to value everyone and to let everyone know that they're valued.
Did you have those discussions when you were chairman and CEO of the league with either with the clubs or the rules committee about how to value those players that didn't play on the day?
No, I didn't. I must admit, there weren't really many opportunities to do that. That's the sort of thing that you do at a private meeting of a club where all the players gather around and they ask you for some thoughts about, what makes a good club, and that's when I'd discuss it. But not at some of the functions that I went to. So no, I haven't really discussed it. I've discussed it with the players. The disappointment I had. And, that's the way the game goes. I think things are changing. I think clubs now really do value all contributors, and that they show that too in the way that the players gather around the club and become more part of one football team.
Now, as we mentioned, you effectively, running the competition from 1986 through to 96. Now, in the mid-80s, the competition was in an interesting position. Like even clubs that we know now to be powerful, clubs like Collingwood, weren't in the strongest shape. I mean, your former club, St Kilda, had just won a fourth consecutive wooden spoon. Over that next decade, so much happened. We had the growth of Friday night football. We had night finals. We had the introduction of 5 interstate clubs. That the league transitioned from the VFL to the AFL. We had the merger, obviously, between Brisbane and Fitzroy and all others that were discussed over that journey. Of all of those, is there one that you look at over your tenure in the game as the most significant transformation or the most significant legacy, if you will?
Yeah, I think there are lots of things that contribute to all of that. I mean, you've got to remember that when we started to transition to a national league, the league was broke. It was dead set broke, and the expansion to a national competition was as much to save us as it was to save the game, to save the VFL as it was to save the game Australia-wide, because, sponsors were starting to think more nationally and not by state, and the TV networks were starting to set up. Up until then, all the stations were all independent and they were happy to cover a game in their state, but forget about the rest of it. So it was all these things came together in that early, mid to late 80s period. But I think the one thing, and I mentioned this in my book, the one thing that I think we did that saved the league was to eventually get Sydney to be successful. If we had not have been successful in the New South Wales market, forget the National League. When we got Richard Collis involved and we got Kelvin Temple in as the CEO, things started to move. And people who knew football rather than Edelson, who didn't know, a boot from a bloody football, and a number of others, we started to get football people involved, and they knew what to do, and they knew how to gather people around them to make a club strong. And Richard Collis was a major factor in that. He was there for a long, long while, and Sydney had some great success while he was there as chairman.
Darren mentioned mergers and all that happened during your time. There was plenty of possible ones that could have gone through in all that time. You got Fitzroy and Footscray, and Melbourne Hawthorn, St Kilda, Carlton, and I think North at one time were even talked about.
Yeah.
Is there any that were like basically a signature away from happening? Were they that close that it was almost really an actual thing?
There's one you didn't mention, which was a combination of Melbourne, North Melbourne, and who's the other one? Melbourne, North Melbourne, and someone else. It might have been Fitzroy or Footscray.
Yep.
Yeah. So they were all struggling at the time, and Peter Scanlon, one of the commissioners at the time, he was a great North Melbourne man. He got these guys together, and they started to talk about a team called Melbourne United, and it really progressed along very well until they got to the stage of trying to decide who'd be president, and that's when it fell apart. So you can have some of the greatest ideas, but then when the passion of it all gets in the way, you get into trouble.
Now, on the topic of mergers, you obviously copped a fair bit of flack during those late 80 years, and to the point where, you know, there were some pretty nasty comments on bumper stickers and banners and stuff around the western suburbs. I think Up Yours, Oakley was one of them. But through that period, and then obviously through until July 4th, 1996, when that merger went through with Brisbane and Fitzroy, how did you deal with that kind of attention, and what was what was your motivation to continue to push for those things, having been through that experience in 88, 89?
Well, the motivation for it was that we felt at the time, given the financial position that the league was in, that we couldn't keep 10 sides in Victoria alive. Nowhere else in the world are there 10 professional football teams in one city. It just doesn't happen. You've got to have support behind it. Now, ours is a fantastic game, and ours has greater support than most leagues that you find dotted around the world. But we didn't have that much support to support 10 teams, and we were struggling for dough. We were just starting to build a television program, a network together, and getting the television stations to understand the value of a national competition. But we still had these 10 teams that were struggling in Melbourne, and we didn't have the finances at the time to support them like they have today. And so the pragmatic members of the commission said, look, if we can encourage a merger, and we can encourage it by giving them, you know, some terrific benefits and some money, that's going to benefit the league. But what we didn't really fully understand was, I think, the depth of the passion, even in the poorly supported teams. Fitzroy had 4,000 members, but the passion when it was talked about a potential merger, and the same with the Western Bulldogs, where they'd been trying to raise enough money to survive for like 2 or 3 years before the merger was a possibility. And once the merger became a possibility, then all hell broke loose, and all of a sudden Footscray supporters came from everywhere. And I take credit for the survival of Footscray, because they raised something like $1.8 million from Up Yours Oakley stickers. I reckon I should get some credit for that. Just one other funny story. I had my card in for a service down in South Melbourne. I was taking a cab back to the Lee, and I had a taxi, whatever you call them, voucher, and I gave the cab driver the voucher, and he was sort of filling the voucher out, and he wrote Oakleigh, which is not the way to spell Oakley. And he looked up he stopped the lights at Swan Street, and he looked up, looked down, he crossed it out, and he wrote Oakleigh. I thought, oh, that's pretty smart. He's thought about that. And I looked up, and there's an Oakley, Up Yours Oakley bumper sticker on the car in front. So not so smart after all.
You always got to use the reference materials around you.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Obviously, there's a lot of things that we could ask, and I remember in 1994-95 the Save Our Saints campaign, and I was 9 years old, and my dad actually explaining to me the perilous position St Kilda are in, and I went with him to Princess Park to watch St Kilda play Essendon, and we had the tins that were rattling and raising money, and St Kilda lost by 116 points that day at pouring rain, but I just remember learning a lot through that. I mean, as somebody who in the inner workings of the league, how perilous was it for St Kilda during your time? How close did they come, and how hard was that in the back of your mind, knowing that you were a former player?
Well, no, they were not as close as clubs like Fitzroy, Footscray, North Melbourne, and even Richmond at one point, even the famous Richmond club. And they were in a perilous state, so St Kilda didn't come quite as close as those teams did, but they were. Look, we had more than half the teams that were technically bankrupt in the mid-80s, technically bankrupt. The only way we could expand the national competition was to use other people's money, and that's why we went into private ownership. We couldn't do it ourselves; we didn't have the money. Private ownership, whilst we now say, of course, that private ownership is long past, and it's good that it's past. Without it, we would not be where we are today. And I talk about the guys in Sydney who put millions of dollars in, the guys in Western Australia that put millions of dollars in. They are the ones that really saved the league, because without their money, we couldn't have had a national competition. And a national competition has driven television revenue from when I joined the league was $3 million a year. Now we're talking $250 million or $300 million a year. And that's what saved football.
Now, moving from clubs to locations, and one that was connected with St Kilda, Waverley Park.
Yep.
It sort of happened, well, the wheels were probably in motion when you were still there, but happened after you finished up. Was there really any big plan put in place to try to make sure that the ground's going to stay, or was when you were still there, was it at the point of going, there's pretty much no turning back on this one? It's gone. That's it.
Well, the view was at that time that Waverley wasn't working as a match of the day ground. It just wasn't working. That it probably was better placed to have a couple of football teams playing out of it, and to make it a home ground for two teams. And at the time, St Kilda was, you had Moorabbin, and all the issues that St Kilda had with grounds. I think they felt that Waverley was not a bad solution at the time. It wasn't that far away from the St Kilda support base, and it was actually not a bad ground, other than the fact that rained too often and the wind blew a fair bit. But they could be a home ground advantage, I would have thought, if you wanted to look at it positively. But they were pretty keen, and they were into it because they got a pretty good deal out of it. We moved on from then. We've understood that, and we understood then that Waverley wasn't ever going to be the highlight match of the week because it's too far away from things. Melbourne's set up like the spoke of a wheel. You've got Melbourne as the hub, and then all the railway lines and the bus routes all run out from Melbourne. Waverley's not even on the end of one of the spokes. It's in between two spokes. Waverley Station doesn't get there, and the next one south of that, I think, is Oakley, or if you want to go further out, Dandenong. So if you wanted to get to Waverley and you didn't have a car, if you had a car, you'd probably wait an hour to get into the bloody ground anyway. But
6 to get out.
If you want to get out, yeah, more to the point, getting out. If you wanted to get to Waverley, you'd have to. If you lived in say Collingwood, you catch a train into Flinders Street, get onto the Waverley line train, take the train out to Waverley, and then get on a bus to get to the ground. Well, you don't do those things these days. You can't do those. People won't do that. So that's where the Dockland Stadium came into the vision of the league, and it was Jeff Kennett that pushed it pretty hard, and it's turned out to be a great success because you can get to it so easily. It's got trams and rail and whatever else. So I think we noticed, we knew right from the outset that Waverley was a second best, and that's why we did the deal at the MCG to put all the games of the day at the MCG, and to try and lift the importance of the MCG in the whole scope of things, and that's enabled the money to be generated to build the great stands that we've now got at the MCG. It was built off the back of football, not off any other sport.
Ross, last one for me, and I'm sure we could keep going for a couple of hours just chatting with you about the history of football, but you've mentioned already that the strength of the league relying on a strong Sydney club. One of the things that happened in that kind of early to mid-90s period was the trade of Tony Lockett to the Swans. And there were a number of clubs, I think, at the time, including St Kilda, that thought he was a done deal to one of another bigger Melbourne clubs. There was Collingwood and Richmond that were both involved in talks and discussions. What are your memories of that period? And I guess walk us through that particular trade from St Kilda to Sydney.
I honestly don't know the inside out of what happened there. I rarely got involved. In fact, I never got involved in any of the player trades, unless, of course, we found out that one was done underhanded or they were breaking the draft rules. I don't know what happened with Tony Lockett. I presume that Sydney came up with a fantastic deal and sold him the whole concept of his name in Sydney would be like an absolute superstar. The focus would be on him. But it was interesting that Tony was actually a very quiet, shy guy, believe it or not, and I think he looked at Sydney and thought, I'm not going to have as much pressure on me up there. There's not going to be as much notoriety. And I think Sydney eventually worked that out and was quite happy to just have the name Lockett there and have his presence on the field as opposed to, being the superstar, as it were. But I've got no idea what the deal was and how it was done. Not the Commission's business, unless, of course, they broke rules.
Lucky last one. looking into the modern times, obviously beyond your time in the game, were the AFL right in the way they handled the Giants and the Gold Coast Suns, and would they be right to put a team in Tasmania?
Okay, the first one, the Giants. Sydney was always going to be a market big enough to take another team, and I think that's reasonably understood. The Gold Coast, there's 600,000 odd people in the Gold Coast area, 600,000 or 700,000 people in the Gold Coast area, and we thought it was a decent market because the Brisbane Bears went into that market. But again, we had the wrong people running it, Case and you want an hour, another hour? Case and Paul Cronin, it was a terrific guy, and he gave his heart and soul to that whole thing, but he didn't know a lot about football. And then Reuben Pellerman. Oh well, yeah, there's another hour. We could do a couple of hour programs on Case, Reuben Pellerman, and we arrived there one day, and he said, "Did you bring Tony Lockett with you?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "We need a full forward. You need to give us Tony Lockett." I said, "Reuben, have you heard of the draft?" He said, "What's a draft?" Well, you see, the way players transfer between clubs, there's a draft system, and you have choices. No, we want Tony Lockett, and that's what we were up against. And I suppose to some extent you can see why it was tough. But see, he had the money, and he helped that club survive because he put probably $6 million into it. And eventually, they went to Brisbane, they went to the Gabba, and it's now its own story. But looking back, you wonder how we ever got through it all, but we did. Eventually, it came out the other end, looking all right.
How do you feel about a Tassie side?
Oh yeah, that was the other part of the question. Look, the great problem in Tassie is that they've got a population of 500,000, 600,000, somewhere around that figure, and they're split in all the different towns. So that's one issue: getting crowds that will come from Launceston down to Hobart to watch a football match, or the other way around. The other thing was getting sponsorship support. The problem, and it still is the problem, in my time, and it still is the problem. Tasmania is a branch office for most companies of Victoria. Now, the Victorian manager usually ran Victoria and Tasmania. And so where's he going to put his money? He's not going to put it down in Tassie. He's going to put it in the Victoria, where his base state and all that is. And there's no big corporations other than the hydroelectric and Cadbury in Tasmania, or there certainly wasn't. There are a couple of other growing corporations now that were big enough to take on a major sponsorship of a local team. So we really had trouble working out that Tasmania could actually financially support an AFL team. And it didn't have the money to say, well, here's $100 million, we'll spread it out 10 million a year over 10 years like they did with Greater Western Sydney and the Gold Coast. The league didn't have that sort of money then. So we weren't able to throw money into the ring. The Premier said, we'll put $28 million in. And I said, for how many years? Understanding that the moment he got kicked out of office, will the next Premier put $28 million? Politics is a game that ebbs and flows. It depends on who's the Premier and what what interest they've got in Australian football. So we weren't prepared to make a decision to put a Tasmanian team in off the back of government money. That just, it wasn't always going to be there. Now, of course, the league is very financial. It has money to support teams for over an extended period of time, and you have to do it over an extended period of time, or it's just not going to work properly. But they have got the money now, and I know there was a paper done not long ago by a former commissioner in my time, Colin Carter, about a team in Tasmania, and he argued that it was time and it was possible with some league support. So let's see what happens. It's a great football state. There's no doubt about that. Some of the footballers that have come out of that place have been sensational over the years. So, I think it's a possibility at some stage in the future.
Well, Ross, you were custodian over a period of great change for the game, and we really appreciate you giving us so much of your time tonight. And obviously you were an unlucky but very good chapter of St Kilda's history as well. So thank you very much for joining us.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks, guys.